Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. I met one or two at a church I spoke at this weekend who tuned into the webcast, and so after talking for a few minutes, I was able to confirm that indeed I really am so conservative I can't turn left even when I'm driving. That means this is not a safe space for those who may be easily offended by having their ideas challenged or by our satire. This is broadcast number 123, and this week we have River Higginbotham, co-author of ChristoPaganism, An Inclusive Path, and Bill Honsberger from Haven Ministries to delve into the question, can Wicca, paganism, and Christianity peacefully coexist? My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior researcher is Ron Hensel. And here is Ronnie to introduce today's sponsors.
Ronnie, yes. Well, greetings from sunny Florida, where the sun came out, and we saw the sun. The palm tree came out. You saw a shadow. Now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors today include World End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas. And it's on World's End Theology Outlet, and the Designer Jesus Collection. No more. You need to have your Jesus be an embarrassment in your social circle. Visit one of the great runway fashion shows for the Designer Jesus Collection coming to a church runway near you. And if you like this webcast, or if it annoys you and you want to inflict it upon others, please, to ensure your continued access, go to outreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. And please don't forget to subscribe to us on YouTube. And
now we're back. And so Bill Honsberger and I, just to let everyone know, met initially in 1993 at the Parliament of World Religions, where both of us had the opportunity to talk with a number of Wiccan groups and interact with some of the leadership and sort of get the inside scoop on what in general, Wiccans would say they believe. And what I discovered at that time is they usually start off with something that goes along the lines of Wicca for me is, and then they'll describe what their particular beliefs and practices might be. In September, late September, we did a webcast on the Parliament, and Bill was part of it. And a Wiccan had tuned in, and we were having a little bit of interaction in the chat area. And they said, why don't you have a Wiccan or pagan on? We said, we'd love to. We've tried. We haven't found anyone brave enough yet. Of course, we do have some pretty interesting satire, so that might be an embarrassment to them. But but they contacted River, who is part of Circle Sanctuary, correct?
That is correct. I'm part of the Circle Sanctuary community, which is based in a nature preserve in Wisconsin, and I'm a minister through Circle Sanctuary, among many other things that I also am.
Okay. And so they contacted River, and he emailed me. We were going to try to do this actually from the Parliament, but due to technical issues, we were having too much echo, so we decided to reschedule and do it today. Unfortunately, he's with us. So you and your wife are both involved in Wicca, paganism, some variations of those two?
I would say Joyce and I would both be more comfortable probably saying that we're eclectic pagans. I will practice along the lines of Wicca from time to time. Joyce has in the past. Joyce's religious journey has been started off in reorganized Mormon Church of Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, now known as the Community of Christ.
Right.
Independence, Missouri, and that's her hometown. And then she morphed into being Catholic, and then morphed into being other, and then neo-pagan. I myself started off with roots in regular old Protestant Christianity, and as in the Presbyterian Church USA, until I was in college, and then I kind of stepped away from that and emerged into the New Age and neo-pagan movement in my early 30s.
Okay.
So how do Wicca and paganism relate to each other?
Well, they do. I would I characterize Wicca as one of the significant paths or traditions, if you will, of a broader term of paganism. Paganism has come in the common usage today as many different traditions as an umbrella that would include Wicca, some people who are, we call themselves witches instead of calling themselves Wiccans, or can include heathens, can include heathens are also true, can include ceremonial magicians, paganism can include people who blend different paths. People can be pagan who are just eclectic and draw their religious inspiration and traditions from a number of different traditions. There's Celtic beliefs and culture inform some pagans, and for some they do it real strongly toward the trying to find the right historical precedents, and we would call them like Celtic reconstructionists. And there's people with some people follow the old Egyptian or the old Greek or the old Roman pantheons. Some embrace even in modern current Aboriginal or indigenous beliefs and traditions, and all of those can kind of get mushed together as forms of paganism. So Wicca is certainly one of those, and Wicca is really an important piece of it because it's pretty popular in the United States, UK, and other English-speaking countries, and more around the world.
Now, it's pretty fair to say that words like pagan, heathen, and things like that, they don't really get a fair shake from your perspective in the media. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah.
In terms of the broader culture?
I think witch, Wicca is a little bit more nuanced for modern culture. Pagan are all have been pejorative terms in the past and are largely misunderstood. And now this was very true in the 80s and 90s. It's less untrue now. I think these days, if you said pagan, more people would understand what you're talking about. You're not talking about what the Greeks did and what the pre-Christians around the world did, but you'd be the neo-pagan movement's really the modern movement. There's a pagan scholar called Isaac Bonowitz that talked about neo-paganism, mesopaganism, and I'm missing his other term, but basically the most ancient forms. And Bonowitz really kind of helped coin the term neo-paganism, as far as I'm aware.
When I think of the 80s and paganism, I think of the movie Dragnet. Do you remember that one?
Yeah, Dragnet.
And this little thing that came out, pagan stood for people against goodness and niceness.
And then some of them like Baphomet a lot, So
someone like what?
Baphomet, the upside down goat head in the middle of that inverted pentagram represents the personage of Baphomet, which some people get into that.
See, I wouldn't have even known that if you didn't tell me. Oops, excuse me, I'm gonna stop that.
It's Baphomet's the really scary devil-looking god image.
So pagans are not into human sacrifice, generally speaking?
No more than anybody else in the 21st century.
Okay. How much are we into it, Don? I forget. No.
We kind of gave it up last week because the authorities were really irritated about it.
If you think about cultures going way back, I mean, there was a time when human cultures that sacrificing animals and sacrificing people seemed like a thing to do, but not in the 20th or 21st century. Sorry.
So they're definitely not mainstream if they're doing it.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
You might decide what mainstream is.
Yeah, we have to define that.
So I think one of the things, and River, you were explaining it well. One of the things I've noticed in talking to a whole lot of the different varieties that you just brought up is that there's a streak of nobody tells us what to do in all of them. And you guys looking at me and go, "Hey, man, we have no pope, no bishops, we don't have any leaders." And so the usual way I try to find out what a person's into is, so who are you reading?
Yeah.
Because it's not a top-down central authority like RLDS, as your wife was in, or Catholic, or things like this, where there's a deep structure you can obviously observe. Most Wiccans, Pagans, goddess worshippers, whatever I talk to, really prefer, at least the way they've said it, in not having leadership. So that's why I was curious about when you said they're not part of the mainstream, because I don't know who gets to determine the mainstreams. Like amongst Protestant Christians or amongst Muslims, who gets to decide?
Pagan was already
who's on the outside.
When you go back to ancient times, when Europe was, you could say, maybe depaganized by the 11th century, and even then there were still pockets of paganism in Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, that area. Paganism was such a broad word. It covered an extremely wide range of beliefs and practices. So
it means that today, I think in the if you go back to the historic term, it's actually Latin, and it meant country dweller, the paganus, and then that came from really around 300 AD, where you've got the Roman Empire became Christianized under Constantine. That became the trendy thing to be, is to live in the city and be Christian, like the emperor. And then the people who held to the old ways were the country dwellers, and they worshiped those old pagan gods, which were no longer popular. So then, as the Christianization of Europe continued into the 11th century and beyond, you had more and more people who in the country kept the old ways. And I think pagan was used as a pejorative during what modern pagans call the burning times, or the Inquisition days, where the Catholic Church went on a rampage against whatever they thought really wasn't serving their interests at that moment, and were quite brutal about it. So there were times when being called pagan was a pretty serious, had serious consequences, and maybe was as bad as being called a witch. So in the modern era, pagans are reclaiming the term pagan and witch and Wicca as things that we voluntarily say we are, and have good intentions around all of those.
Among Spanish-speaking people, pagan is still a surname.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that could get a little confusing.
If I can offer just one small correction. Constantine didn't actually make the empire Christian. He made it legal.
Yeah.
Okay.
His son Theodosius is the one who actually signed the decree making Christianity the state religion.
Oh, cool. Well, thank you. Thanks for the...
he made it a religio licita, a licit religion.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that.
Yeah, Constantine was a weird guy. He gets baptized the last day of his death, but or before his death, of his death, maybe it's this way. But he supports Christian movements, and he supported pagans as well. He was putting money into everything. He was a modern politician in that respect. He didn't want to cross any lines.
So, yeah, and then, you had his son Constantius II, who kind of went back and undid some of his dad's work, and then later on it was a seesaw in the 4th century, and then you get to Theodosius, as he says. But do pagans and Wiccans today see themselves as a kind of a recovery movement, recovering ancient ways?
Yes and no. There are certainly people who would classify themselves as neo-pagan or pagan, who are definitely recovering and wanting to recreate like ancient Greek, recreate ancient Celtic traditions, and people that are sensitive to the fact that traditions that used to be kind of whole and complete in their tribal origins, wherever they were in the world, are subject to being diluted or destroyed or messed up by cultural appropriation and borrowing. So there's some people that are really trying to get back to what was this really like back then, and then take their spiritual inspiration out of that and try to live that both philosophically and in some cases literally as to the best of their ability. And then
Okay.
those people are really serious about the history. I mean, they study history deeply to try to pursue those aims.
So now you just mentioned a time when paganism / Christianity did not peacefully coexist, and it kind of began in the 4th century. And I would add another little tweak to what you said is it was not just the Catholic Church. There had not yet been a schism between East and West. So you had both Greek-speaking Christians in the East and Latin-speaking Christians in the West, launching waves of persecution for all practical purposes against pagans, tearing down pagan temples. This did happen. It is part of church history. And it wasn't a time of total peaceful coexistence. It was a time when Christianity was now in the driver's seat, whereas before they had been the persecuted. So that's also another dimension that needs to be brought in.
I was going to say that you can't really say it started in the 4th century. It started almost from the beginning. You can find all sorts of, from the pagan perspective of the Roman Empire and some of the other, colonized places, Christianity was being nailed.
Oh yeah, you had some very
prior.
And really, frankly, you never had any the viciousness of some of the Christian persecutions against Christians. The Neronian persecution, for example, the Decian persecution. Some of these were just horrendous in what they did. You have, in southern France, they would heat up a metal chair, and have people sit in it, burning them alive on hot metal if they didn't recant. When we get into the Middle Ages and the Inquisition, then you have some pretty nasty stuff being done in the name of the Pope out in the West. So it comes in waves. It's very, nobody would say this is a good thing today, I don't think. I hope. So today, though, is this a question that comes up in the minds of Wiccans and pagans? Are we going to get persecuted the way it happened in the Middle Ages?
Well, I think there are fears about persecution, and then the stories about the persecution specifically in the Middle Ages, the witch's hammer, Maleficarum. I am mangling that, but it was an instruction book on how to persecute witches in the Middle Ages. Those are kind of collective memories for people who've taken on this modern cloak of, okay, I'm going to call myself a pagan, and what does that mean? Well, it means that there was people at one point who found pagans really either offensive or not aligned with the current power structure, and therefore adversaries of it, and therefore needed to be suppressed. I think there's been a resurgence of paganism. This NeoPaganism is really a new religious movement. Its roots were in the late 19th century and earlier 20th century, but it really kind of took hold in the 60s. I don't know, and I don't know if you do much research on generational theory, but if you're familiar with the book Generations and the author Strauss and Howe, they talk about how there is a generational in the United States shift every once in a while between a Great Awakening and then secular crises. So in their view, the Great Awakening that occurred in the 1960s put fuel to a lot of movements that included kind of the rise of neo-paganism in the West, and particularly in U.S. culture.
Well, you really see that if we follow through the story of Scripture, because for us the Bible is our final authority. You really see that all the way through Scripture. You see, for example, let's get to the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel comes into existence. They have periods of real closeness and orthodoxy to God. They last very short time, and then the subsequent generations start adopting the rituals and practices from surrounding nations, worshiping of false gods. And then somebody rises up and calls them back to orthodoxy, get rid of the temples and altars and so forth. That goes okay for a while, and then they go back in. And we have the same thing really within the Christian church, is you have periods where it's solidly biblical, but they're short-lived because then it becomes very political. And politics has its own sort of character and power structures, and religion is then used as a club to beat people into submission, and God is the club. If you go against me, I have the club called God that I will beat you to death with for eternity. And that's a pretty scary thing. Now, having said that, I do believe, and the other two here would affirm this, that there, let me do it this way. One of the common themes that was at the Parliament this past time, almost everyone I talked to says that all paths lead to God. And I had to admit that, yes, all paths lead to God, but that isn't the end of the story, because there's a meeting that takes place there, and the scriptures are clear that every knee will bend and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So those who do that in this lifetime will spend eternity with God. Those who wait until that meeting will be eternally separated from God. That would be our view. In the meantime, do we treat those who we disagree with kindly? My response is, yeah, I think we're required to. Bill, what would you say?
Well, that kind of gets back to the point I wanted to ask River about. Yes, the scriptures command us, Old and New Testament, both to love our neighbor as ourselves. It doesn't say love the neighbor that you agree with, love the neighbor you like, and love the neighbor that is, in total agreement with you, because that doesn't exist with anybody. But it does say to love those who you disagree with and even pray for those who persecute you. And one of the saddest things to me in Christian history, alleged Christian history, is whether it's the Inquisition, which was, or witch trials, or all, there's been a ton of evidence, dirty laundry, shall we say, of people who call themselves Christians, chanting Ave Maria while you slay the natives in, Philippines or Guam or a bazillion other places. Of people who are completely disobeying what God says to do towards people you disagree with. The early church was so committed to this, going back to the persecution. If you got baptized, you didn't join the army. You had to quit the army if you were in there. You couldn't go to the Colosseums ever again because you couldn't watch people get slaughtered. They were so committed to that. And then after Constantine, and in comes Augustine and his influence and stuff like this, the Christians are now the empire. And so the army becomes a Christian army, quote unquote. And that's the Holy Roman Empire and all that fun stuff. Mm-hmm. My point is this: the people who call themselves Christians and who attack, slaughter, malign or whatever, people of any other religion are disobeying what God says to do. Now, River, what I wanted to get to you and ask you, most of the people I've talked to when I teach classes on world religions, and I've taught at several schools, is that in one way or the other, paganism in all its forms deeply imbibes the idea that the divine is in all of nature. Is that correct?
I think most pagans would agree with that, yes.
Yeah. So my point would be, and I wrote a paper on this after the Parliament of World Religions, after listening to Phyllis Carrault and talking to Don Frew and listening and reading a whole bunch of stuff. I really thought witchcraft was a joke. I thought, oh, come on, I watched Bewitched and I watched the Wizard of Oz. This is not a real thing. And then all of a sudden I get to the Parliament and realize, oh my gosh, this is a huge thing. The Covenant of the Goddess and all that fun stuff was ISIS and everything. I had no idea how big it was. So it got me into studying and reading quite a bit of the literature and talking to people. And I talked to a lot of Wiccans. Used to be at all the psychic fairs. You don't see them as much anymore. But so if in fact it was wrong for the medieval Catholic Church to burn witches per se, okay? If in fact that's wrong, how does one assert that on the basis of paganism? Because a deep part of seeing the divine in all nature is what scholars call, there's a trio here, sacred sex, sacred dance, and sacred death, which is why you were mentioning the sacrifices earlier, why you saw it in virtually all the ancient pagan cultures is this realization that since death is part of nature, just like sex is part of nature and the dance, quote unquote, then death is also. So you can see this in religions virtually all over the world, where you sacrifice, to make nature work, to reproduce nature, to make the fish come back, to make the rivers, flow again, to make the volcano, keep it from overflowing. There's a zillion varieties of this in all these ancient religions. So my question has always been to Wiccans, well, if nature truly is our guide, as it were, then what makes it wrong for one person, called themselves Catholic in this case in the 1400s, what makes it wrong for them to kill a witch? One, if they're living out their religion, so if you're going to say all religions are one, like Don was talking about the attitude of the Parliament. Two, on the basis of pagan spirituality, believing that nature is in fact divine, then where does nature teach us it's wrong to kill? I don't think nature teaches us it's wrong to kill your neighbor. I think nature teaches us it's right to kill your neighbor, especially if they're old or slow or young in some way.
Okay, now, Bill, I want you to hold that thought, because we're going to come take a short break from the sublime to the utterly ridiculous, and then I want you to rephrase that for River to respond to.
Are you calling our sponsors utterly ridiculous, Tom?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay, well, let's talk about World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time is gone. As some questions, are you still trying to figure out how to clean up in the ministry business? Do you want to finally learn how to get to the bottom of growing a successful church? Would you like to flush away your failures and start having your best church now? Well, you need Charlatans Ultra Soft, because nothing says theologically soft like Joel Osteen's Charlatan Ultra Soft. It is personally tested by the man himself. It provides comfort where it counts. It wipes away even the most stubborn orthodoxy, and it comes with a money-back guarantee. Keep those butts in the pews with Charlatan Ultra Soft at World's End Theology Outlet this week. Go out and get some. It's great.
Okay. Now, River, does he need to repeat it?
Before. But I like it.
Yeah, and it's so true. River, does Bill have to restate those two questions, or
No, I'll answer. I'll answer for a bit, and Bill, feel free to re-up if I miss some of the points. Nate, the way I understand paganism and nature religions in general is that they work on cycles, and they honor the cycles of life and the web of life, the interconnectedness, the cycles of life, and that we eat and exist based on eating plants and animals. And you look through the ecosystem, and everything's eating something, and everything that lives dies and becomes food for something else. So there's all of this cyclical nature that is just it's all over, and there's a great wisdom in that, I think. And I think a lot of pagans find the cycles of the seasons, the cycles of life and death. They find that significant. In that, they find significant spiritual wisdom and guidance. And so, to kill in and of itself, there's a difference between things dying and things being killed. If you have a prey animal and a carnivore predator, the predator will kill a prey animal, and because it needs to survive. And the prey and animals that are prey animals have adapted in ways to adopt that. In fact, I was recently listening to an interesting analysis of Christianity, looking at how the pastoral situation in Levant and in the Holy Land back in the days when Christianity emerged. You've got shepherding people, you've got agricultural people, you've got flocks, you've got predators. I mean, there's some parallels to be drawn that I found were quite interesting. Okay.
No, you go. I want to hear from you. Sorry.
Okay, so back to now. I would say that in my experience of studying Christianity, it is a theology that has got a kind of a linear arrow of time.
Yes.
That you are, we are existing in the here and now, and there's a relationship with God, and there's the death of this life, and there is the afterlife that is expected to come, and things we do in this life have a consequence in the afterlife at Judgment Day. And that's a Christian linear. I'm going forward, and I'm not going backward. I'm not going in circles like pagans go in circles.
Right, absolutely.
And those are two very fundamentally different ways of perceiving what reality is.
Yeah. It's and you see the cyclical point of view. The Stoics, for example, assumed not only a cyclical existence, but that each cycle identically repeated the previous cycle. So that, you really weren't responsible for what you did because you're fated to do what you did in the previous cycle.
And is that intended to be maximally boring?
Well, I think that in the case of the Stoics, ironically, the Stoics were very moralistic, and so you would think, how did they come to their moralism when they believed you really aren't? Well, basically, they didn't believe you were responsible in the sense that you're going to be held accountable in a judgment one day. And so that kind of relieved you of some burden. But at the same time, they had to counterbalance that with, well, you should still try to do what's right. And, you have these long Stoic treatises about doing what's right.
Whatever that is.
Well, yeah. and then I think that really kind of speaks to Bill's question, is that, so is it okay to kill witches in the medieval days because that's what the Christians and the Catholic Church found was appropriate? And I would say no, but it's a function of what is the moral span that is applicable in the culture in which you live. And
does culture determine that morality?
It informs it, certainly, but okay. I don't know that it determines it.
Well, okay, that's an important distinction. If culture informs, then you can't really blame the medieval Catholics or the colonizing, conquistadors or anybody for doing what they did, because they're merely informed by their culture. But I think the point I was trying to make earlier, if God tells us, which I believe he does through God's word, if God tells us, do not murder, he doesn't say do not murder unless the culture says it's okay, or do not murder if you really, really need to right now. He says don't murder. Like he says, don't lie, don't steal. These things aren't open to cultural interpretation in that sense, because cultures have always come up with stuff like this. And so at least you get into ethics and all that formal philosophy stuff, what's called divine command theory is the idea that God establishes what's right and wrong, and it's not dependent upon anybody's personal whims, that's egoism or cultural relativism or anything like that. So if you're going to say it's informed by our culture, I would argue that, at least from my perspective, the idea of the Christian church jumping into the world, taking at a minimum the Hebrew commandments of God, don't do certain things, do these things instead. They're going to cross every cultural line I can think of, and they're going to change some cultures and stuff like that. The point I was making earlier is on the basis of Wiccan spirituality, if nature truly is the divine, and so we can learn wisdom, I'm going to quote you, wisdom and guidance from nature itself and the cycles of nature. Well, if we're going to learn that, then certainly at least a part of that is you need to now embrace sacred death. The idea that death is, in fact, part of the cycle of life, and we're going to sing this stupid song if we're not careful here. And that's like I said, that's these ideas are thousands of years old. This idea that somehow through death, just like sacred prostitution is thousands of years old, but just on the the lower end, sacred sex. Sacred death means you get to kill, or you need to kill, in order to keep the divine happy in some sort. And the Azteca offering the captive's heart to the sun was to make sure the sun would come back. There's so many examples of stuff like this all over the world. So the pagan mindset has no problem with killing, at least because it's part of nature itself.
Well, at least a certain bandwidth of paganism. I can't speak for all. I mean, I haven't studied all of the historical accounts of the explorers when they encountered pagan tribes and their practices, but Bernal Diaz de Castillo wrote, The Conquest of New Spain, and he has a very detailed record of what Cortez's men saw when they arrived in the Aztec Empire, and one of the first things was the human sacrifice of two young boys, and their chests ripped open and their hearts pulled out. And this was something that was actually documented by the Aztecs themselves. We have fragments of their writings where they actually draw pictures of this for us because they were proud of it.
Yeah, one of the side notes here, Ron, I think is important is that the Spaniards, I mean, these are hardened killers. These are killers. These are not soft guys that are going to be shot because they see it. These are guys who are so stunned at the level of violence they see, when I can't pronounce the long name, but what's now Mexico City. When they come in there, they are stunned by the level of violence. And again, I'll make the other one, going back to the Celtic ones. When Caesar's guys run into the Celtic Empire, and that's been a long war for hundreds of years, long before Caesar, but when they run into the Druids and the Druid practices, despite, the apologists for the Druids 20 years ago, when they ran into it, these are real serious killers. These are murderers. These are people who are skilled at killing, and they're stunned at what they see. It's so over the top from their perspective. I mean, it's way over the top for most of us all today, but from them perspective, for you to shock them. I used to be a deputy sheriff, and I worked in a jail for several years, and there were murderers. There was a lot of them, but then there's a murderer's murderer. I mean, he's a man's man. He's willing to kill anything and any time. And those guys are thankfully rare, but they are out there. So my analogy is here that there are certain cultures that are so violent, they're so over the top violent, that even other violent cultures, recoil in shock at what they've run into. But my larger point is still, and this one's still for you, River, is how does one say it's wrong to do those sorts of things in broad category if in fact nature is our guide and gives us wisdom? Because we see nature, we see violent, all you have to do is watch Animal Planet for 5 minutes, and what do you see? Animals killing each other and making little animals which kill each other. It's just the normal course of the day.
Well, I think the normal predator-prey animals, you kind of have to factor in. Well, so what's the culture of being a predator cat, or being a rabbit, or being a rodent? The culture of the creatures in the natural web of life are not nearly as complex as the culture of human beings. We've developed immensely complex societies, rules, religions, ideas about deity and God. I think the Ten Commandments, emerged in the Hebrew era as guidance. It's like, hey, if you want to live better, do this and don't do these other. Do these 10 things. Follow this guidance. It's better. I think the law in the Hebrew traditions is ways to live better, and I think that man has been on a continuous journey of trying to find ways to live better with ourselves, and we've become more and more complicated as time has gone on, and I think we must spend even more energy now discerning, what is good and what is not good.
Back to the question, where does
Well, I think what he's saying is it's an evolutionary thing. In other words, you're seeing it. In other words, we are more evolved than the animals.
I think I would agree.
And we're more evolved societally.
Yep.
Let me challenge that for just a second, because I think you're asking the right questions, Ron. River, on what basis would you argue that societies as a whole, whatever the heck that's supposed to mean, have evolved into a higher morality? Because we've managed to kill more of each other in the last 100 years alone than even existed in many centuries in human history. I mean, we are so much better at killing now than we used to be. So I'm looking for this golden age of evolutionary societal development that you're referring to, and I'm not seeing it.
Well, I think that you're correct, and so correct in identifying the fact that as human societies have evolved, our technologies have evolved toward being more and more deadly. And that we are actually contemplating the existential crisis of a nuclear war wiping out most or all humanity and life on this planet at some point. I mean, we're all praying that doesn't happen. You guys, the Christian community prays to God, and pagans pray to the goddess and nature and our better natures to not suffer us all such a calamity. But the capacity for destruction is at an unprecedented high point now, and the capacity for destruction in the hands of people who are not morally higher, that don't have a moral span that respects life in general, respects other cultures in specific. That leads to the calamities that we saw in the 20th century, the Nazis, the Maos, all of the horrific things that we know from our either lived experience or recent generational past. We know about all that because we're students of history.
Well,
Yeah,
would it be fair to say that pagans and Wiccans do not see a need for an ultimate philosophical, mainly ontological basis for morality, for discerning? In other words, is this something that we just constantly, we're in process, we get better at, we're developing as we go along, and maybe morality 1,000 years ago, or I'm sorry, 1,000 years from now in the future will be even more developed, and they'll have it more better than we do today. But there really isn't, not only is there not any ultimate philosophical basis for morality, right and wrong and ethics, but we don't really need one. Would that be an acceptable pagan belief, a common, or maybe the norm?
I would say a more common pagan belief comes from the Wiccans. You've heard the Wiccan Rede as a philosophical statement?
Yes.
Sure.
So
I don't remember.
Repeat it for Ron. He doesn't deal with it.
Repeat it for me. I'm not into. Yeah.
No, I'll address it. It's and it harm none, do what you will. So if it doesn't hurt anybody, do what you will. Now, but that brings you to it's a simple statement, but what is harm? So you still got to discern what is harmful. And so, is killing a human being harmful? In the 20th and 21st century, we would say, yeah, that's pretty harmful. And the state would have something to say about that, in that murder is not legal in most states, and it's contrary to the Ten Commandments, also, by the way. So, that for me, that was a really central ethical point that got my attention when it came to me paying attention to pagans and Wiccans. Is that when I had been raised Presbyterian. To me, the idea of sin became something that I just couldn't accept anymore. So I had my crisis of Christian faith at that point, trying to figure out what was going on. And I read a book by Margot Adler, who was a reporter on National Public Radio, fairly recently deceased. She was an admitted witch and wrote a book called Drawing Down the Moon, which describes the varieties of different expressions of NeoPaganism in the United States in the 1980s. It's kind of a classic. It was the first book that I had read that told me that there were pagan people out there in the United States and our culture. And I read the phrase, "and it harm done, do what you will." My response to it was, well, maybe that's something that I could believe in. That it sounded more right to me than where I was at that moment.
Maybe I can rephrase my previous question. Christians enjoy, we prefer to speak in terms of moral absolutes. And I when you said you couldn't agree with the Christian definition of sin anymore, did that come along, was that accompanied by a rejection of the idea of moral absolutes?
If I had thought about it more carefully, maybe I would have said yes, but I didn't consciously frame it that way. I just knew that the idea that I could act in a way that would offend God and that would be important to God became, in my mind, absurd.
Oh, okay. So God doesn't take offense.
If God is omnipotent, I thought, then God is not an offendable entity. Now that that's my concept of God evolving.
Right.
And that's kind of how the evolution trajectory was for me.
So you would agree today, though, with the statement there really aren't moral absolutes there are norms, there are guidelines, there are things you never want to do. You never want to harm anybody, and you want to be careful how you define harm so that you don't make it too elastic. I mean, after all, those people in Mexico doing the human sacrifices probably thought they were doing something good for those boys, that they were.
Every culture thinks that. They
Well,
always,
they were, yeah. The Aztec sacrifices were, in their belief system of that culture, were for the greater good of the peoples.
Right.
in virtually every pagan culture thought this exact same way, that these sacrifices were something that you needed to do because nature itself was so important and we're a part of it, therefore. But this gets me back, I'm still waiting for an answer on this one, River. And I'll give you another way of saying it. You said that the Wiccan read, let's assume just for a second that it's true and that we have a common understanding of what the word harm means. So, all right, let's say don't kill anybody. That sounds an awful lot like a moral absolute, one. Two, where does nature show us that? Because it sounds like the read is itself a philosophical claim that's not empirically driven from nature at all.
I think that it is a philosophical claim, and nature alone doesn't provide you all of the guidance in order to discern what is good. I think what is good is a construct of human discourse and engagement, and I think our concept of good evolves through time, because I believe that human cultures evolve through time. It's part of what I've studied.
Or they devolve.
And they can de-evolution of culture and society is entirely possible and should be guarded against. And that's why talking about sacrifices, the military men and women and individuals in our armed forces are willing to sacrifice their lives, put themselves in harm's way for important ideals that represent freedom and liberty in the United States. And that's a different way to frame sacrifice. But there are people voluntarily willing to put themselves into that kind of harm's way for a greater good. Now, it just so happens to be framed in terms of this culture and nationalism and things like that.
River, I'm assuming, like all of us of our age, you probably read the short story, The Lottery, back in school, and that gives us this picture of a lady who's more than fine with sacrifice happening somewhere else. But what's interesting is her way of justifying that is it's good for our village that we have the lottery. I've heard of villages, other places, and they don't have the lottery, and they've gone down. But our village has done this forever, and we prosper. That's, I think, a very common pagan mindset throughout most of the pagan cultures, is that these things are good because it brings the fish back, it makes the corn grow, it makes the sun come back. It's always a way of making nature harmonious with us.
I think that's a great point, and to me that speaks about magical thinking. That if you think that because you condone stoning in your village, as the lottery story described, and that brings goodness to your society, then you do that. But I think, in my view, that is magical thinking, and there's weakness. There's weakness in that. I would reject that.
I want to jump in here for a second and kind of. I'll shut off your mics. I have that power. I have the power. To come back to a couple of things that you've alluded to a few times already, and that is the 10 Commandments. I want to start there and then come forward on a couple of quick things. The 10 Commandments, I would suggest, is an outline of the 613 laws given in that time. What was the purpose of that? Was it just a guidance? Well, we believe, obviously, we're conservative. We believe God gave that to Israel, but it was for a particular reason, which Paul tells us later was to demonstrate our sinfulness. It wasn't a guide on how to live. It was to demonstrate our sinfulness. And that Christ died for the ungodly, which is all of us. Those who come to faith in him by grace alone, through faith alone, in him alone, are redeemed. We are now in Christ, who already fulfilled all of that in our place, because we were incapable of doing that. So that brings us to the next thing. That's the meeting with God, which I mentioned earlier, and you've kind of pointed to once or twice. When that meeting with God occurs, those who are in Christ will be with God forever. Those who have not come to Christ, their deeds will indeed be held against them for what happens to them eternally. That would be our view. Which then brings us to the question that Bill has been kind of dancing around with and Ron has been working with. I'm just going to ask more forthrightly. If your view is true, as I'm understanding it, that truth really is just relative, it's culturally determined, that there's no moral absolutes. The Wiccan Rite of Three then would be your cultural view on how to treat each other, but it's not an absolute view. You couldn't really say that another group that believes burning, which is a good thing, are doing wrong. You could only say that it would be wrong for you to do that. You couldn't really say it's wrong for them because their truth may be something else. So maybe their truth is it's good to, beat witches, as Bill might say this, beat witches, burn witches. It's sort of just a moral, to beat a witch, burn a witch, or take a witch to lunch are just morally equal choices, it seems to me. How would we get around that?
Well, I really don't see that there are moral absolutes. I don't.
Okay.
So would you criticize the burning times then?
Yes.
Why?
Because people with power killed other people.
That's not new in this world, and that's all over nature. The bigger ones eat the little ones, right? So if the burning times if it was really wrong, whether you take the silly PBS movies or anything like that, or you take Jerry Gardner's, fantastically bizarre number 9 million witches, you can't really criticize the people who did those kinds of things, whether it's one witch or 9 million is irrelevant at this point, if they're living out their own cultural norms.
Well, if they're more cultural norms are that barbaric, then I suppose you're right. And if they have the capacity to kill people, then good on them.
Barbaric implies a judgment that you've thrown on them. It seems like that's truly inconsistent with a real cultural relativism. You're going to say, well, that's the way they think, and gee, there's no absolutes to say what's right or wrong about this. Then again, whether you burn a witch or take a witch out to lunch doesn't really matter in the big picture because there is no big picture. There's just only these little subplots, these little cultural islands, and they all do their own thing.
Well, but all those cultural islands exist in a much larger stew of cultural islands, and we're all in that same stew.
They do. And one of the big stews that we had at the Parliament was almost everybody I talked to included Jesus into their scheme in some way. But they all sort of had a different version of the Jesus in their scheme. And one of our sponsors kind of addresses this, if Ron is ready.
I think I am. Well, let's start with a question, and that is, do you cringe when the Christians you hang out with try to introduce Jesus to your non-Christian friends? Well, you can say goodbye to the days when your church's Jesus was a source of social embarrassment. Now, even your church can keep pace with the latest fashion-forward trends in spirituality. Introducing the Designer Jesus Collection. These amazing new Jesus styles are hitting church runways in the most exclusive Jesus fashion shows at churches near you. You don't want to miss Yoga Jesus, Hipster Jesus, Buddy Jesus, Socialist Jesus, Mormon Jesus, and, of course, Muslim Jesus. At Designer Jesus Collection fashion shows, you will find a Jesus you'll be proud to introduce to your most sophisticated, cutting-edge friends and acquaintances. Please observe the attendance requirements. Cost of admission, your eternal soul, required attire, semi-formal. All proceeds benefit His Royal Majesty of the Kingdom of Darkness. The Designer Jesus Collection, London, Paris, Rome, New York, Salt Lake City, and a church runway near you. So you want to check that out. I'm glad you appreciate that.
Now, let me jump in here. I've got one more Jesus specific reference. Here's a book that I found kind of interesting.
Okay.
Right.
Jesus through Pagan Eyes.
Okay, great.
Which is written by Reverend Mark Townsend. He's from England, and he's a clergyman, formerly a Church of England, now a priest in the Open Episcopal Church, which is obviously a lot more open-minded version of Episcopalianism than the standard variety.
I don't know, they are pretty open anyways in England, especially. So for him to go outside, that's even more amazing.
So what this book covers is views of Jesus from a number of different neo-pagan personalities. And it includes some essays, one of which is by my wife, Joyce. And it gives an account of her personal spiritual path and kind of how she views Jesus these days. Because Joyce was, as I mentioned, Mormon, Catholic, then neo-pagan. And she, many of our pagan books, we've written the 3 paganism books. Many of those were written in a monastery, in a Christian monastery, when Joyce was on retreat. A lot of the composition time occurred in that setting. And then it's also got some essays about Jesus from different pagan famous folks. And it's got a foreword by a gentleman named Matthew Fox, who you may have heard of.
Oh, definitely heard of Matthew Fox. Yep.
Anyway, thought you might be interesting to be aware of that.
Yeah, well, it's a good book it's good to know about from our perspective. You know, we're talking about earlier how even though there are these cultural islands that promote things that are contrary to the morals of the broader culture, and they seem to be small cultural islands, there was one part of one episode in history where there was a small cultural island that took over a nation and it plunged the world into the most disastrous war in history. In 1932, the Nazi Party took a third of the votes in the German federal election, and yet that was all they needed to first form a coalition government with other extremist parties. It was really because there were other extremist parties like them that they had this chance. In fact, in 1932, they actually took fewer votes and lost seats in the Reichstag from the previous election. So they were the Nazi Party was technically going down, but they were still the party that that was the most prominent of these extremist parties. So they were able to form a coalition. Hitler was able to take power, and they were, gradually able to strip away all the freedoms that the Weimar government had established in the previous decade. So what we're saying here is that even a minority can come in, their ideas can spread and become the general ideas of the public. And Germany was, throughout the 20th century, Germany was one of the most advanced, not just, scientifically, technologically, but culturally. It was considered one of the most advanced nations on the face of the earth. And yet this is what happened.
We go back to the question that River's already commented on several times, and I think his answer is correct from his vantage point.
Right.
Is he couldn't really say that they were wrong in what they were doing because it was culturally accepted in their culture, and there are no moral absolutes by which you can measure. So there really is only what I believe should be done, right or wrong, but that doesn't mean it's universally right or wrong.
And what I hear in some of the questions and discussions here is, isn't there a danger in moral relativism versus an absolute understanding of what's right and wrong?
Right. That's I think what we're getting at.
And I think you're. It's a great question, and I would say that there's a growing common understanding of what what is good in the minds of humans, and in the minds of humans can be on the entire world level, or it could be in smaller groups, I don't know if you're familiar with a book called Spiral Dynamics and the work of Claire Graves, a sociologist, psychologist from Canada, and the 2 people who wrote Spiral Dynamics, Don Beck and Christopher Cohen. Very interesting perspectives on the evolution of values and the evolution of culture. I think it's been a very informative thing for me, And I think it can be an informative thing for us all, even though we may come from a very serious Christian perspective as well.
We're really
Gone in 1993. Hans Küng, famous, sort of defrocked Catholic theologian, introduced the Towards a Global Ethic, which was also at the Parliament in Toronto last month. One of the interesting things to me about that is that there was only 4. So he basically reduces the 10 Commandments to 4. Don't kill, don't rape, don't lie, don't steal. And there couldn't even be a consensus on those 4. Several groups walked out. They wouldn't accept this whole thing. They still can't get everybody on board with that. And I think the idea that somehow this is evolving, let's just keep it really simple. Is it okay to murder? If a culture says it's okay to murder, and there are many cultures that historically have, in the middle of a very pagan worldview comes this little weird group of Jewish people with this notion that they can say comes from God, that it's always wrong to murder. That there's no cultural lines, there's no lines in the sand you cross where, well, it used to be bad, now it's okay, or anything, or vice versa, or whatever. So that erupts in all sorts of places 3,800 years ago. Yet my point when you were saying cultures evolve, well, I'm saying we're not even catching up with what was revealed 3,800 years ago by God, because we're slaughtering each other at record rates now. So how do you, I don't understand that. It's kind of a hopeful leap, I guess, to claim that these societies are somehow, developing more and more consideration. This idea has been around for thousands of years, and yet we still see murder.
Yeah,
we see it all over the place, and now we see it in greater rates. We see governments slaughtering their own people in the last 100 years. At like whether it's Mao Zedong in the Great Leap Forward, or Pol Pot, or Hitler, or Stalin in Ukraine. I mean, so many of these guys doing this. So where is this evolution of culture that you're pointing to? Because I don't see it.
You know what, guys? We are at the top of the hour. We had committed to a certain amount of time. Obviously, Ron has to leave early. So if you can do a short answer.
Right now, but I forgot to tell you, apparently I have more flexibility than I thought last time I talked to you.
Okay. All right. So, River, if you could do a short answer on that, I want to do a wrap-up thing and then say we want to continue this in a future time if we can.
That'd be awesome.
Because I really think, as you know, I'm conservative. I really believe the Bible is the Word of God, and that salvation is by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. I also am committed to, and I think you understand that now, understanding what somebody else believes, even if I disagree with it. We should treat each other kindly in spite of our disagreements. So, in light of that, do you have a quick wrap up for what Bill was
Unless you're a Red Sox fan, we got to draw the line somewhere. We don't have to be next to Red Sox.
We're Cubs fans here.
I'm not. The Cardinals and the Red Sox have no affinity. I promise you.
I know.
Anyway, I think Bill, it's to say that it is complicated is an understatement. There are. I've been puzzling this for a number of decades about how we live together and work together, and how do we seek better understandings of what is good in our societies. One of the writers that have influenced Joyce and I a little bit is Steven Pinker. He wrote a book called Angels of Our Better Nature, where he lays out an argument that we are living in a better and safer and kinder, less violent world now than ever. All the cited atrocities notwithstanding.
We can say that from the safety of Harvard, Yeah. Live in the real world.
Yeah.
Well, his books are rather full of data, so it's like you got to chew through them. But I do believe that things are getting better and better and better. And then I look at the pagan world, and I'm thinking to myself, well, is paganism helping make anything better, or is it just confusing the matter? And is religion itself not that idea of making things better or not? And I think that there's a great potential for improvement by taking in the wisdom of the ancient traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and taking in the wisdom there, filtering out the parts that were culturally that we don't want to bring forward into the present day because they really were not as culturally sophisticated or evolved. But I think there are great nuggets in the past. And one of the things that neo-pagans do is they look under lots of other rocks for nuggets of wisdom and find creative ways to bring them into a personal practice. And I am not necessarily a typical pagan. I think my views are more more liberal.
Is there a typical pagan?
Not much.
Is there a typical pagan?
No, not really.
Okay.
There were 7 principles of paganism Joyce and I attempted to define, and we could, it's the best we could do, but I'll briefly give those to you. That you're responsible for your beliefs, for the beliefs you choose to adopt, that you're responsible for your own actions and your spiritual and personal development, that you are responsible for deciding who or what the divine is for you and forming a relationship with that everything contains a spark of consciousness, that everything is sacred, that each part of the universe can communicate with each other part, and these parts often cooperate for specific ends, and finally, consciousness survives death. Those 7 principles, we said, oops, my dog's going crazy, but most pagans would agree with that.
The divine
we believe.
As soon as you finish that list, your dog went nuts.
Yeah.
Is it the profound truth or the profound absurdity? I don't know.
Okay. All right, Bill, 15 or 20 second wrap-up statement.
Oh my gosh, Don, don't do that to me. Look, I think there's really clear choices. As a Christian, I know it's wrong to kill a witch. It's always wrong. I don't get to do it in medieval Europe. I don't get to do it in Salem or anywhere else, because Jesus says it's wrong to murder. And so I'm going to stick with that. Whereas I think if I'm on the nature side of the discussion, I can't say that. I can't say it anywhere. I can literally say it's okay to kill anybody anywhere because that's what nature teaches. So there's the conundrum, I think.
Okay, now Ron, on your end, before we do the march out order here, if you had a wicked neighbor, would you be afraid of them?
No, I wouldn't.
No.
The only thing I'll say is that I hope in our next broadcast we will also spend some time clarifying Wiccan beliefs, and especially what Wiccans don't believe. I think a lot of people walk around thinking Wiccans are witches, witches worship Satan, and that is the equation that they live by. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not afraid of a Wiccan. I would probably be a little hold at arm's length the person who said, yes, I worship Satan. That would probably cause me to think a little. I mean, just, Satan is the prince of evil, so why would you worship him? So yeah, that's what I'd like to say for next time. We covered a lot of ground. We've covered probably so much more than I thought possible.
We did, but it was, as Ron's worked with me a really long time, and he knows that for me it's important for Christians, those who name the name of Christ, to understand what others believe, even if they disagree with it, to properly represent it, even if they want to say it's wrong. At least be honest with saying this is what's wrong, and this is what you actually believe. With Wiccans, it's a little more difficult because, as we pointed out several times, no two Wiccans will enumerate all of the same things. They'll start out with Wicca for me is, and so we have to say, okay, what is it for you? When I had one of the individuals in my church, I told him we were doing this program, and I'd been to the Parliament and those kinds of things. He said, well, we had a Wiccan living next door to us, and I was afraid. And I said, why? And as it turned out, and part of her ritual was also sex was part of a ritual and different kinds of things like that. And I said, well, other than getting involved with that, you maybe should have had over for a barbecue and just talked, because they're not people to be afraid of. They're just regular people. I would say spiritually confused. Of course, I would say that because I believe the Bible is the authoritative word of God. Salvation is through Jesus Christ alone, not by any works. So that's about as clear as I can get on that. But we want to do this again in the future if you're up for that, maybe after the first of the year.
I'd be happy to jump in here and have another go with this with you guys. I appreciate it.
Good.
Thank you for being
All right,
here.
Ron, would you walk us out of here?
I will be glad to do that. Okay, our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our culinary services comes from Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Justin Case. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D. Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polly Gummas. Our liberal denominations bureau chief, we mentioned him earlier in the show, Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys, Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping, and our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you'll never prove it in a court of law. Ever. It will never happen.
Never happen.
So,
all right. And to all those who are watching, we will be back this time next week.
Same time, same